for the same amount of strain, overall for that workout, the stress is significantly higher in the middle around threshold. So whilst it might feel more satisfying to do, lots and lots of sweet spot work, the reality is that the time that you need to recover from that, is going to be more significant.
The Triathlon Show 226. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode it's my great pleasure to welcome David Tilbury-Davis back to the podcast. For long-time listeners, David has been a guest on twice before, and he is a coach from the United Kingdom, having been in the coaching space for 25 years or so, working with both professional and age group athletes, helping them to multiple national and even world championship titles, as well as a large number of wins and podiums in various races across the globe. And many of you listeners will probably already know that David coaches Lionel Sanders. That's definitely the most recognizable name on his roster of athletes. And you might even have seen David recently on Lionel's YouTube channel, where he has been featuring in some videos. This interview with David is slightly different from the other ones in that now David is actually not just a podcast guest, but he is my coach. We started working together in November 2019. And knowing how many requests he gets for his coaching services, I would consider myself very, very lucky to be in that position. And I also think that the fact that we now know each other well and have discussed training a lot together, that really comes through in some of the discussions we have on in these two episodes, because this will be a two-part interview, where this episode 226, is more about David's perspectives on the training in general, so relevant for anybody that listens to the podcast. But next episode, next week, will be specifically geared towards coaches, and we will discuss his perspectives on various topics related around coaching. That is not just how do you program, how do you prescribe sessions and so on, but more philosophical questions as well around coaching. But that is for next week. Let's get on with these training perspectives right after we thank our sponsors, Precision Hydration. You can find them on precisionhydration.com, and the best place probably to start getting to know them is by taking their free sweat test. On the website it says free hydration plan in the website menu, and that test consists of a quiz of 10 or so questions that you can answer, and then as an output you'll get an estimate for your sweat sodium content and an idea of how much sodium you might need to replace if you are racing, for example, in particular in longer and hotter races where electrolyte replenishment may become pretty significant for not really finding that your performance goes down the drain. And Precision Hydration's products are electrolytes that you can buy in different concentrations so that you can match the sodium content of your individual sweat. So that is the whole idea behind Precision Hydration. It's a great idea and works really well. I really like to use their products, and I generally go for the pretty concentrated stuff because that's just the way my sweat is. You can get 15% off your order with the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW15 on precisionhydration.com. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. As many of you will know, although Roka has now branched out into many different product categories, wetsuits is where it all started for them. And this might be actually something that is quite pertinent for the current situation that we're in with the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we discussed with James on Thursday's Q&A episode, for some of you, open water swimming might be an option. And that means obviously needing a wetsuit. You might already have one, but if the water is pretty cold, then perhaps you would consider getting a thermal wetsuit. And that is something that Roka do offer, so that you can potentially get into the open water in much cooler water temperatures than you would otherwise do. If you do, please be safe. Have somebody with you to monitor you, and make sure that you take all precautions as you should always do with open water swimming. Whether it's a thermal wetsuit or something else like their new max buoyancy wetsuit, a new piece of tri-suit, or new pair of sunglasses that you're looking for, you can get 20% off your entire order with a promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the interview with David Tilbury-Davis. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, or welcome back, David. How are you doing today?
Not too bad, Michaela.
Are you in lockdown?
We closed our borders today, and I live in Helsinki, Finland, for those people that don't know. We closed our borders today. Schools are closed. People over 70 have been advised to self-isolate and not come into contact with other people. So it's interesting times. We'll see how things evolve. I think at the moment we have, certainly yesterday, it was about 300 cases on the 16th of March. So, but the expectation is it probably, is 30 times as much, was the president's comment in the media yesterday, that it could be as high as 30 times as much due to sort of the amount tested.
Yeah, and I follow the situation in Finland as closely as I follow the one in Portugal, being from Finland. So yes, I knew the situation before asking, but it's good to get some context for the listeners. For some more context, you've been on the show before, but can you give a brief background of you as a coach and where you come from and that sort of thing?
Absolutely. I've been coaching since sort of 1995, 96. And over the years, have been based in the UK, have been based in Spain, been based in the US, and now I have a young family. I'm based in Finland, and predominantly work remotely, but also travel quite a bit to work with clients face to face. And from my perspective, have taken a position of, just coaching a handful of athletes globally myself, and that's it. So I kind of keep it simple, and just try to, make people the best athletes they're capable of being, whether they're professional or age group.
Yeah, perfect. And I've mentioned this in the intro, but you don't know that. So just so that you are aware, I am one of those lucky athletes that's part of the handful.
You are indeed. Yeah, you're lucky or unlucky. I'm not sure, depending on the training sessions.
Yeah. This morning wasn't too bad. I had the pool open still, and it was a solid swim, but manageable. So let's get into the topics that we have for today. And first, if you can describe your general philosophy on coaching and training.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I come at the approach of helping athletes be better athletes by trying to understand them as individuals, trying to understand their sort of athletic age, so to speak, their athletic background, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, where they want to go, with an increasing level of fitness. Some people, it's that they want to do a personal best over a certain distance. Other people, it's they want to, qualify for certain events. Other people want to get on a podium, and other people want to be world champions. But certainly the philosophy in all of those individuals is typically very much the same. There's a very high level of internal drive to just be the best that they're capable of being. And so that really, I reflect that in how I coach. I take a position of trying to sort of persistently stay on top of, research and knowledge in terms of sort of physiological development, technical development, coaching skill sets, coaching athlete interactions, basically anything that impacts on performance. I'm paying attention to, stroke interested in, and then, as somebody quaintly put it, trying to then be the BS filter for athletes, because there's certainly times when, I get approached by a product provider or an equipment manufacturer there, and they are, trying to explain that this is the best thing since sliced bread, and I have to sort of filter that for athletes.
So on a bit of a side note here, but are there any things, any piece of technology or things like that you have seen in the last few years that has not been, that you have actually been convinced by, that you think is really, really something that can help athletes reach a new performance level in among those things that you have been approached with, for example, or just seen in general come out to market?
I think off the top, I could probably name a couple of things which I think it would not be unreasonable to say have or can impact on the efficacy with which people can train and perform. I think heart rate variability is one. The ease with which athletes nowadays can monitor that is really a great way for folks to understand what is the systemic stress on their body, because there's I don't disagree that subjective sort of assessment of workouts is valuable and meaningful, but the reality is that there can typically be a bias in there from an athlete. Some people like to do high intensity things. Some people like to do long, slow distance things. And, some people like to do very detail orientated sessions. Some people like it to be very sort of autonomous. That can be reflected in that subjective assessment of that workout. So, perception of effort has its place, heart rate has its place, power has its place. But I think when you're trying to understand sort of systemic stress on the body, whether it's the training or whether it's, having, a rough time with one's partner, or whether it's work stress, or whether it's, being concerned over the current climate, that's a very useful tool. Much like a screwdriver in a toolkit. It's definitely useful.
Yeah. Going back to the coaching philosophy, then perhaps you can just give an overview of what does the routine work look like when you're working with an athlete? Perhaps not when you're starting out, but when you actually know the athlete a bit better. What goes into sort of applying your philosophy, or not your plan, your ideas for how to improve the athlete's performance, and how does that play out in the real world, to give the listeners an idea from just sitting down and thinking about assessing previous workouts or benchmark tests, and then thinking about how to improve from that, and anything that goes into the stages in between.
Absolutely. I think a simplistic way to look at it would be to say that probably 80% of how I structure workouts and sort of training development frameworks is very much grounded in sort of an evidence-led approach. My understanding of physiology, my experience of coaching in a practical sense, and just knowing that you can only do B after you've done A, and then C after you've done B, kind of thing. But then probably another 15% is with the type of individuals that I work with is kind of pushing the boat out a little bit, and really just sort of just trying to find the sort of the limit of development without pushing people over the edge. And then, I'd probably not unreasonably say that probably sort of the last 5% is just, ultimately a little bit of guesswork of just looking at, novel approaches or novel stimulus to help athletes develop.
Yeah. With the 80% that you described first, is that do you have specific periodization structures or sequencing of types of work that go into that 80% that you refer to, or what specifically is it that you refer to there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it depends on the individual circumstances. So I think, the sort of cohort of individuals I work with is typically training anywhere between sort of 16 to sort of 25 to 27 hours a week. And as a consequence, I would, openly admit that biases that approach a little bit. So as a consequence, I do look to develop people in sort of specific blocks of work. At a high level, you would probably describe that as sort of initially very sort of, quality of movement orientated, and then a block of very sort of intensity orientated, and then a final block of very sort of race specific orientation. Now, the lengths of those blocks and the minutiae of those blocks depends on the individual, depends on the race schedule, depends on where we are in the season, depends on the racing demands. But that's sort of the overarching principle. Is that grounded in what we understand in terms of the best way to develop athletes physiologically? There's probably some differences there. Certainly the science says if you're trying to develop threshold, you should probably focus on threshold for sort of 8 to 12 weeks. In my experience, what I found is that because long distance triathlon is such a unique sport, there really isn't any other sport where, certainly you take the context of Ironman, where athletes are operating at the sort of the upper limit of their ability for, anywhere between sort of 7.5 to 15 hours. There's no other sport that places such a huge amount of duress on the body, and as a consequence, the training demands of that are incredibly unique. So, yes, we can look at what people do in long distance swimming. We can look at what people do in marathon training. We can look at what people do in long distance time trialing in cycling. But the actual sort of the interlacing of the three places such a unique demand that from a training perspective, you can't ignore that. You can't train the swim as a swimmer and the bike as a biker and the run as a runner. And so from a structure point of view with my athletes, whilst I accept that there might be better approaches if you were just trying to develop one thing, I have to think about the fact that we're trying to develop 3 sports at the same time. And I need to factor into that. That places a unique sort of cognitive demand on athletes, and unique recovery demands.
And do you think that you can develop all 3 disciplines simultaneously, or do you think about them in terms of perhaps 1 or even 2 being more in maintenance mode while trying to focus on 1 or 2 disciplines for improvement?
I think it's contextual. I think, the swim, most athletes can push quite hard in the swim up to a certain point. I think somebody that is a fairly good swimmer and maybe has a little bit of a swim background would probably find sort of, pushing quite hard in the swim in the context of triathlon is doesn't take that too much out of them. Whereas if it's somebody that is an adult onset swimmer and is really trying to develop their ability to sort of maintain their technique, for a long period of time, under sort of a sustained amount of power, they might struggle with a really sort of long, hard workout. So there's some context there with the swim, but I'd say the swim, typically you can do a little more intensity than the other two sports. And then again, coming back to that word of context, with the run, if I have an athlete that weighs 55 kilograms, the amount of running intensity that they can do almost certainly differs from the amount of running intensity that a sort of 78 kilogram athlete can do. That's just basic physics.
For sure.
So then you come to the bike and say, okay, well, the bike is sort of, non-weight bearing. It's kind of very much it's a closed energy system. You've got these sort of 3 contact points. You're stabilized in gravity. So then it becomes, very much about sort of developing the cardiovascular system. And then, for most people, you can do a reasonable amount of intensity with the bike at the same time that you're doing it in the other two sports. But it's also probably the one where, the longer the sessions get, the more sort of neurological fatigue that you get in the lower limbs, and just generally within the body. And so that can then impact on the swim. So there's always, different factors to consider with different athletes.
And what are some key highlights in terms of how you need to think differently about triathlon compared to the single discipline sport? So if we, for example, take running as an example, and we compare it to a typical marathon training program, so what makes triathlon different, even as one endurance sport compared to how runners can train? And then if we take apart triathlon into just the run training of triathlon, what makes that different from the marathon training program?
I mean, if you talk to some of the professional athletes, they would say that, really in the context of their actual, fitness, running in an Ironman is not that fast. They're capable of running significantly quicker. What the struggle is the capacity to maintain, sort of form, turnover, fueling, over the race, and over the run portion of the race, with having preceded it with the swim and the bike. And so that presents a unique complexity that is very different to training for a marathon. And likewise, very serious marathon trainers are typically doing, 2-a-days. And you can't really do that as a triathlete, because you've got the swim and the bike to train as well.
Yeah. Do you think that the crossover effect there between the disciplines help triathletes to get a lot out of their potential in each discipline, despite not being able to put in anywhere near as much hours as a single sport athlete can do?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's strong evidence that, a significant amount of volume on the bike, that develops aerobic capacity, carries over to the run, but clearly what doesn't carry over is sort of resilience from a biomechanical perspective. I would say that from a swim perspective, probably the influence is a little bit less, and that's just typically because the sheer volume of swimming that triathletes do is proportionally less than the biking.
Yeah. But if you have somebody coming from a college swimming background where they have put in 20 plus hours per week of swimming, then you do see these professional triathletes that come from that swimming background and very quickly becoming really good on the bike and potentially the run as well.
Yeah, because the engine is developed. It's the capacity to express that is the is the limiter. And I've seen that in athletes that have come from a run background or a swim background.
So what are the ways that we can improve the capacity to express the engine? Perhaps let's say that you are maybe somebody who can't tolerate that much running because you're injury prone. Are there any tactics that you can employ in training to improve that if you have a generally good engine but you struggle with the run, for example?
So if we're going to, I mean, that if the sort of the specific of that question is sort of, okay, if you're limited in the run, then certainly you can offset some of that limitation through doing more aerobic work on the bike if you have the time available. If you don't have the time available, then, I would say probably the most sort of important run session to do would probably be one that stresses your body, and your muscles with different contraction rates, different force production rates. And that really is, running sort of, trails or a little bit off-road on, forest paths or single track. And not getting too hung up on the intensity of that. As long as it's sort of comfortably aerobic, you can sort of reasonably chat whilst you're doing it, then there's a huge amount of benefits to that type of workout. So that would be my number one sort of go-to run workout if somebody said, well, I need to kind of improve my ability to run well off the bike.
And if we take the question to the swim, because a lot of listeners probably have a good engine, a relatively good engine, and potentially even they can do a pretty fast 400, but when it comes to a half Ironman or a full Ironman, then basically you just don't have the muscular endurance to keep up a solid effort for the entire duration. What would be a good go-to session for working on that ability?
So if you're talking about it purely in the context of sort of, the muscular endurance, then I would say, as boring as it is, just repetitive work where there is a moderate amount of load, is really the best way to approach that. So, like 10 by 100, 10 by 150, 10 by 200, 6 by 400, those types of workouts, which they're quite, that's a fairly lengthy amount of swimming, and that you might build up to. But the reality is if you do that kind of workout and you're manipulating the recovery that you take and the intensity that you swim at, then you can think about it that you're on one side of the spectrum, you've got sort of intensity and maintaining swim speed under load, and then at the other end you've got just getting used to the duration of swimming and maintaining your form and your posture. So if you're at that end of the spectrum, then you might do those types of workouts where you're doing a lot of repetition off a very short rest at moderate intensity, so you take just enough rest to kind of reset mentally, and then you go again. Whereas if you go at the other end of the spectrum, you might even go to the point of saying, okay, I'm going to do 10 by 100, and I'm going to swim the fastest pace that I can maintain for 1K, because that's your 10 by 100. So, and then I'm just going to take whatever recovery I feel is reasonable for me to maintain that pace, and that might be 40 seconds, and that's fine. And so then you've got those two sort of disparate approaches, and with time you might kind of move towards the middle of those 2 points, and then move back out and move back in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I want to go back to one point that you mentioned there with the blocks that you mentioned, and the first block being about the quality of movement. How do you incorporate that in sessions? What does that look like?
So that would be where I might have people doing fairly sort of short and sharp running intervals, where they're working on their turnover and their posture, but actually the length of the interval is such that it's not what you would class as a highly demanding sort of cardiovascular load. On the bike, I firmly believe that the more, as the French would say, souplesse that you can develop, operating at different cadences, the more you improve your cycling ability. So, just having athletes work at a wide range of cadence another approach that I would take. The swim, not so much of an obvious workout or nature of a main set. I might just do shorter, faster reps for individuals with a specific focus on, say, swimming with a snorkel, so they can work on their alignment, and actually see what they're doing, or doing fast 25s, breathing every 3 strokes, those kinds of things.
Yeah, it was a bit of a leading question because I of course have been going through all of these things and recognize them, and the one thing that I kind of wanted to make clear is that there hasn't been a lot of or any drill work in the traditional sense of that word, but it's more about how to break up the session into, for example, in running, those faster, shorter intervals, and that still allow you to hold a good form and focus on turnover.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point. I mean, I think people just see swimming, biking, and running, or within triathlon, they just see it as these are aerobic sports. You just need to get fit. But actually, your capacity to express that fitness is still a pretty key aspect. And I think when you think about, as any coach, when you think about improving somebody's ability to operate in the environment that they operate in, you're always looking to develop sort of situational awareness and get them to use external cues. And I think a good example of this is, funny enough, I was walking past a kid's soccer training group the other day, teenagers, and the coach was making them do all sorts of fancy footwork drills, with a ball around cones. And, I would look at that and say, okay, well, that's interesting. But, all of that individual is thinking about is, what they're doing with their feet. Whereas actually, if you put an external stimulus in front of them and said, okay, well, here's a defender that's going to sort of, be constantly in your peripheral vision and move around and make you have to, react, then that external stimulus is going to create far greater learning patterns. So, it's the same in swimming. When I'm giving an individual cues, when I'm working with them face to face, whether it's in the pool or, or in an endless pool, or whether they've sent me video, I'm trying to give them feedback that says, okay, well, you want to think about X or you want to think about Y, such that their body has to figure out that movement pattern. So, something, if somebody has a lot of crossover in their stroke, I might say to them, think about visualizing some railway tracks, in the bottom of the pool, and that actually, you're swimming down those railway tracks, and your job is literally just to think about pulling down that railway track. Now, because our proprioception in the pool is minuscule comparative to outside of the water, then even if your brain, visualizes that railway track, just think about it with your left hand and really thinks that you're pulling in a perfectly straight line, the reality is you're not going to be pulling in a perfectly straight line. But what your body will be doing is it will be trying to figure out the sort of motor control patterns in order for you to create that movement pattern. Whereas if we did some drill work and I said, I want you to do this with your hand or this with your elbow, then all the brain is going to think about is that hand or that elbow and nothing else.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. That you put the athlete in the situation that they need to perform, rather than just having them focus on one single aspect, completely out of context. Yeah. So let's move on to the next topic and discuss volume and intensity and how to balance the two, how you think about the two.
I don't think it's either or. I think there's always a balance to be found. As I said, I think some of the context of what I do is governed by the people that I work with. So I'm working with people that do train a sort of pretty, reasonable amount of time, if not significant amount of time. And so there is a capacity for them to do, a pretty, significant amount of volume. I think intensity, I think I'd be remiss to not touch on it in the current context of the current climate, and say that it's an interesting one where, any coach at the moment should probably be thinking about, whether it's volume or intensity, how much immunosuppression am I creating in my athletes, and what things can we do to manage that more beneficially. So there's evidence out there that shows that if you do intensity later in the day or even in the evening, then it has a more significant effect on the parasympathetic system. And likewise, are we building in enough recovery time, enough time for athletes to refuel appropriately? When athletes are training full time and doing quite a significant amount of training, there can always be a danger that in between workouts they don't take enough time to refuel properly and rest properly, and that is more paramount in the current climate.
Yeah, definitely. What about in a normal situation, in a normal world, when we at some point get back to that? I think that change your answer.
I mean, it wouldn't really change my answer. I think people underestimate the benefit of appropriate recovery in the context of sleep, nutrition, timing of nutrition, all those things. They vastly enhance performance. That's well documented. And so even for somebody that's training a limited number of hours, there's definitely evidence that taking a pretty polarized approach to your training, even if you're training as little as sort of 8 hours a week, still has its upsides. Then if you throw into the mixing bowl that somebody might have a job which is incredibly cognitively demanding, that creates a unique sort of periodization demand, such that maybe during the week you would do workouts which are not particularly cognitively demanding, and then at the weekend you would then change that situation and go to something which is quite hard, where they're not distracted by sort of the day-to-day minutiae of work.
On that note, something that we've discussed previously but not on a podcast is something that you've described with a chart and a graph that depicts the stress and the strain of different intensity levels of workouts. Perhaps you can go into that and explain that to the listeners.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways out there of measuring intensity that are that are sort of a measure of the mechanical work. So if we sort of simplify that and stick with the bike and say, okay, well, we can measure power, and we know that certain training zones are certain ranges of power. So we know that your aerobic training zone, your endurance training zone, is from point A to point B. Then we need to understand that if you take those different zones, that sort of endurance zone, that sort of tempo zone, threshold zone, VO2 zone, and anaerobic capacity, if we take a simple 2-hour workout and make every single one of those 2-hour sessions exactly the same in terms of the number of sort of kilojoules of work that you do, then when you calculate out this sort of training stress using sort of fairly typical workout structures, then what you'll see is a bell curve. And so what that's telling you is that for the same amount of strain, overall for that workout, the stress is significantly higher in the middle around threshold. So whilst it might feel more satisfying to do lots and lots of sweet spot work, the reality is that the time that you need to recover from that is going to be more significant. So you can do the same amount of strain on your body by polarizing the training more so, and that's not to say that sweet spot training is wrong, because there's definitely cyclists out there and cycling coaches that would argue vehemently against that. But again, I come back to, we're not cyclists, we're triathletes. There's two other sports that we need to train, and there's two other sports that we need to recover from. And then the other sort of interplay with volume and intensity is also understanding that when you have these training zones, that there is a range, and that range is contextualized by the amount of time that you spend in that range. So if you decide to do sort of a long endurance ride, then I wouldn't want an athlete chasing after the top end of that range, and feeling like a rock star for doing that, because actually it's probably better that they're at the lower end of that range. And likewise, if I only gave them an endurance ride for an hour, then it would probably be better that they're at the top of that zone, because physiological adaptation is a sort of somewhat a continuum. It's not like from one zone to the next, it's like a light switch goes off.
Yeah, and just to explain that with the different 2-hour sessions, the idea there would be that if you compare, for example, a sweet spot session with a VO2 max session that have the same amount of kilojoules, you basically, because you do a shorter duration of VO2 max work, let's say you do 10 by 2 minutes, and sweet spot you do 4 by 15 minutes, then the adjustment there to make sure that the kilojoules is the same is that the time that you're not doing those actual work bouts is adjusted within the zone 2 for the endurance segments, or zone 1 for recovery segments, so that kilojoules end up being the same. But then on the other hand, on the output, the training stress score, if we use that metric, will be higher for that sweet spot session.
Yes.
That's an interesting thing, and again, this is something we've discussed. But can you talk about your opinion on how that sort of stress-strain relationship? What is it that drives adaptation? Because here we are trying to equalize the strain, the kilojoules, and then minimize the stress. But what a lot of athletes do is they sort of chase a TSS number. They want to see that their training stress is maybe going up on a week-by-week basis. So in this modern world, we kind of see that training stress often is seen, rightly or wrongly, as a driver of adaptation. What's your thoughts on that?
I think there's a danger in chasing metrics. If you chase metrics, you can get very good at doing things that aren't necessarily a reflection of performance. Whereas you want to always be contextualizing the work that you do with some gauge of sort of capacity. So whether that's a particular workout that a coach or an athlete likes to revert to, that is I'm going to do 6 times 100 as hard as I can off a really short recovery, and if I can maintain those 6 efforts at a certain pace, plus or minus a second or two, and that's improving, over a couple of weeks, then clearly I'm getting better at swimming. My ability to maintain my swim stroke. Or on the bike, it might be, riding a certain route, or it might be doing, a specific test. I try not to get too hung up on the validity or sort of lack of validity of certain tests or certain benchmarks, because ultimately they're just a litmus of, how is the process developing? And so things like, TSS, they're interesting, but it's just a metric. It doesn't measure, it doesn't reflect, and the founders of this would agree, but it doesn't, accruing a certain amount of TSS doesn't reflect, how, say, a female athlete is coping with that, given where they are in their cycle. So there's lots of other aspects to sort of performance development that aren't, governed by metrics.
Yeah. So when you look at your athletes and you look back at a training block of, let's say, a 2 or 3 week block, what defines success? If the athlete achieved what you wanted them to achieve in that week? Is it looking at certain key workouts like the 6 by 100 example and certain others, or how do you go about that sort of assessment?
I think probably the simplest assessment is ultimately how is the athlete finding the workouts. If the subjective feedback is that I felt stronger in that session, or I actually was able to maintain a better pace, or I didn't feel as tired as I felt last week. That's probably the first assessment of success in that block of work. The second would be, over a period of time, we might revert to some sort of benchmark assessment and go, right, okay, let's actually validate, my process and my responsibility and my job as a coach to maximize your potential. And I think that's a key thing as a coach is, we have to hold ourselves accountable. I think saying, the race is the test. Well, that's like saying, I'm going to go to a bank to get some money. Well, of course you're going to go to a bank to get some money. That's what a bank does. And it's the same with a coach. Coach's job is to make you good at racing. But a really good coach's job is to, maximize your potential through a process that's held accountable. And so, that to me is the best way to check how those blocks are progressing is, you benchmark along the way with certain workouts or certain tests or races, but ultimately you're always trying to, calibrate the usefulness of the training process.
Yeah, makes sense. Then what about workout prescription? How do you like to prescribe workouts? What sort of measures of intensity do you prefer to use? And what are some pros and cons of different options?
I mean, pace, power, heart rate, perception of effort, they all have their place. They all have their unique qualities. If I want people to do a very specific amount of work, I might be very specific with what I prescribe. If I want to get the athlete to really, focus on self-calibrating, because there are definitely athletes that are like, hey coach, tell me what to do and I'll execute. I'll execute. And it's like, no, I don't want you to be a robot. I don't, that's a really key thing is I want you to understand philosophically what we're trying to achieve out of this workout. So there may be specific workouts where I say, okay, I want you to do the intervals at this intensity, and I'd use a word, for argument's sake, VO2. And then I'm interested to see what that equates to over a period of time in an athlete. What do they do that at? How does that relate to the previous few days of training? Another approach is to actually, with athletes that I have, I've been working with for some time, I tend to give them a little bit even more autonomy. And it's a little bit fun as a coach, and not to make athletes feel paranoid. And you can speak to this. But I might give a specific workout where I say, I want you to go for a run for this amount of time.
Yeah.
And that's it. And that's the depth of my coaching in that one session. But the key thing as a coach there is I want to see what you do with that time. And sometimes athletes are a bit cheeky and they might go out and crush it. And other times they might take a deep breath and go, I think I'm just going to take a really easy aerobic run. And that's a very powerful sort of learning tool for me as a coach, and learning tool for an athlete. Is sometimes give yourself the autonomy. If you're not coached, sometimes don't get hung up on the workout detail. See how you feel, but then track what that then looks like over a period of weeks.
Yeah, that makes sense. And strength and conditioning, that's another topic that I'd like to get into a bit. What are your thoughts on that? What kind, if any, of strength and conditioning do you think is useful and valuable for triathletes?
I think strength and conditioning is definitely a sort of pillar of performance. It's something that many athletes should be doing. Now, there's people that rally against it and say, well, what if I'm time limited? What if I've only got 8 hours a day that I can, a week that I can train? There's definitely some compromises to be had. Do athletes that want to perform to the best of their ability, do they need to be spending 10, 15 minutes a couple of times a week doing some sort of prehabilitative movement patterns or some exercises that they can do, at home on their own, with things that you find in the home? Yes, I would argue quite strongly for that. Ultimately, at the very pointy end, coming back to that point earlier about creating the ability for athletes to express the cardiovascular potential that they have, what I persistently see in top performers is this situation of having an engine that can out-torque the chassis. That they're so cardiovascularly fit, but they don't actually have the sort of stability to express that fully over a long period of time. Can they sit on the bike and ride really smoothly in a really, really good aero position, that maybe impacts on, a little bit on their breathing mechanics? Have they adapted to that really well? Or are they constantly needing to sit up? Likewise on the run, can they maintain, a strong leg drive, and a good upright posture, sort of chin up, chest up, over a long period of time? And that's what drives then how I would guide people in using strength and conditioning. That it's very much about helping them, maintain good posture and good form. Now, you can come at that from, actual, in situ swimming and, in situ biking and in situ running. But I still think there's a place for doing it, separate to those three sports, because it can only help.
Yeah. And if you have an athlete that's training, let's say that lower end of your bunch of athletes, which would be 15, 16, 17 hours, what would a typical amount of strength and conditioning be in a week? Would they do a couple of sessions in the gym, or would it be more home-based?
I mean, it depends on the individual. I've got some individuals where, they don't have the time to travel to a gym, or there isn't a gym nearby. And so, with not an unreasonable amount of investment, they can they can set up a home gym and get a good amount of exercises done. But that would look something like 3 times half an hour. Now, there are people that might rally against that and say, well, my concern is, I'm gonna build muscle. If I could make people muscular off 3 times half an hour in a week, I'd be an exceptionally rich person.
Yeah.
And there'd be an awful lot of strength and conditioning coaches that would hate me. The reality is you're not going to create hypertrophy off 3 30-minute workouts a week that are predominantly stability orientated.
Yeah. And speaking of the predominantly being stability orientated, what is your take on actually lifting some more weights, doing higher weights, maybe the high weight, low rep protocols that we have seen quite a lot recently in research?
Yeah, there's I mean, that research is good. It shows that you can definitely improve running economy through doing sort of Olympic lifts. I think the context that I would look at there is it depends on the individual and the amount of muscle mass that they have. Because somebody that is has a lot more muscle mass, maybe a male athlete, that isn't built like a marathon runner. So just to pick 2 examples, Jan Frodeno and Lionel Sanders. I can talk in the context of Lionel, and I don't know what Jan does in terms of strength and conditioning. But I'm just looking at those two body types. Somebody with a larger muscle mass would be predisposed to lift more iron, and so the risk there is that you actually create fairly significantly larger amounts of stress on the body by doing some Olympic lifting than you would ideally want. Whereas somebody that doesn't lift as much weight may benefit more from doing those Olympic lifting movements. That's a sort of simplistic look at it, but again, it comes back to physics. Somebody that can walk into a gym and comfortably deadlift 200 pounds without breaking a sweat as a triathlete because of their sort of morphology, is clearly going to cause more stress on their musculature than somebody that would only be deadlifting 100 pounds.
Yeah, that makes sense. The same reason that elite sprinters, for example, sprint very, very little in training. It's just so demanding, so stressful when you have that capacity to cause such a large amount of energy turnover in a short amount of time.
And that's particularly because they're operating at the very end ranges of movement. So that's that's real recipe for disaster type situation, because in swimming, biking and running and triathlon, we're not really operating at the end ranges of movement. You might argue that maybe in the swim, and that's why I would vehemently argue against athletes using big paddles, because their swim stroke is almost certainly not technically competent enough to cope with those paddles, and B, they're then operating at their end ranges of movement, and that's a recipe for loads that joints, tendons, ligaments, muscles can't cope with.
Right. So the next topic that I have here is, can you just discuss your view on the fundamentals of training, and what are the dangers and the potential pitfalls of getting stuck with the minutia and even in hype and fads that you see in the current day and age in triathlon?
Yeah, I think triathlon training, requires a fairly significant amount of doing the basics right, doing just solid aerobic work. Then getting into, specific developmental needs can be driven by, the races that an athlete has coming up, or the terrain that they'll be racing on, or the environment that they'll be racing in from a thermal perspective. Those are some minutiae that you can sort of focus on. But there is nothing from a training perspective, when you see, things that are hyped that, this is going to improve your VO2 max by 5%. No, it's not. There is, there's multiple coaches in multiple sports that if there was something that has been in existence that would allow us to add 5% to people's VO2 max, that isn't pharmacological, we'd have been doing it for a very long period of time.
Yeah, short and sweet. That makes sense. And one final thing before we go on to what will be part 2 of this interview, which will be available for the listeners next week. But I want to go back to the topic of periodization a little bit, because you mentioned working in the different blocks with the quality of movement and the more intensity, and then what did you say that the third theme was that you had there?
Race specific.
Right. Yeah. So is that sort of coming from the Isurin work, from the traditional block periodization, or is it more something that you've adapted?
It's definitely an evolution of Isurin's work, but it's also contextualizing it with the sport that we work with, the demands of it being 3 different sports within one, the the reality of periodization as we know and understand, as written about by John Keeley more recently. So I'm really trying to, move into sort of a preparation phase there for the race where, athletes are familiarizing themselves with, paces and power and speeds that they intend to operate at in the race.
Right. Yeah. And then the question that I want to ask is, can you give an example, and it might be real or hypothetical, of how you apply that sort of periodization to a season with an athlete? So I'm guessing that you're basically just cycling through those 3 mesocycles, so a training stage, if you want to call it that. And you said that, of course, and this is where the racing calendar comes in and the context of it all. But that's why, if you can give an example of what it might look like for a specific athlete with maybe a couple of goal races in different parts of the year.
Yeah, I mean, it is as simple as that. If an athlete says, okay, well, within the next 12 months, the most important race for me is this race. And you go, okay, right, well, we know when that race is. We know that, for argument's sake, we are 27 weeks away from that race. We know that in order for you to achieve what you want to achieve, that we need for you to be in a certain level of physical fitness at that race. So, our goal orientation, for want of a better phrase, is this, this pace or this power or this speed. And we know where we are now, so we do a basic gap analysis, and then we say, right, well, as a consequence, we've got 27 weeks to get from A to B, or is actually, that an unreasonable expectation? Or if it is a reasonable expectation, where do we need to be in, 9 weeks? Where do we need to be in 18 weeks? And then and making sure that we're checking along the way, are we ticking the boxes on what we're doing in order to achieve those benchmarks that allow us to know that we're on the right road to achieving the performance that we want to achieve.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then within each of those blocks, the type of work that is done is sort of fairly similar and repetitive. That being the sort of the gist of it all, that you're repeating work and you're getting a sort of slightly more concentrated workload that you might do if you just mix and match different training types so that you adapt to that. Is that how you think about it?
Yes. I mean, I think, not to state the obvious, but, if I'm trying to sort of develop sort of somebody's sort of VO2 within that intensity phase over 3 discrete periods, there's not going to be lots of, sexy variation to workouts, across those 3 discrete blocks. It's going to be fairly similar because it kind of does what it says on the tin. And, that's the reality of training for performance is, you need to do the basics right and you need to do them well. And so it would be, very similar in those discrete blocks. There might be some subtle differences, but nothing earth-shattering. And that's not because I'm not being dismissive of the need to ensure that athletes are, sort of engaged and motivated and enjoying the training. And that's where, the level of autonomy that I may or may not give an athlete comes into play, where I know with some athletes, if I say, in this context of this example, I need you to do 4 times 4 minutes at this intensity, they're like, yep, absolutely, I'm going to crack on with that. And then somebody else, I might say, actually, we need to do this amount of work, 16 minutes of work, and, you can have this amount of recovery. And as long as you maintain, the work rest recovery ratio, you can slice that up as you see fit. And I give them the autonomy to drive that based on how they feel. And that's much more motivating for other people.
Yeah. Perfect. And let's say you have somebody who's racing a bit more, you can then basically add one of those training stages in between the two races. Let's say, for argument's sake here, that you have 9 weeks between the two races, and then basically just add one of those stages in between and repeat the cycle again.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said sort of earlier on, it's not as rote as 9 weeks and 3 by 3 weeks, and you must do this, and you can only race on these weekends. Yeah. There is subtle shifts where those blocks may only be 2 weeks long. Now, as an example, let's talk about the current climate. I had a discussion with one of my professional athletes this morning where I said, this is what we do, this is what we've always done, but the reality is I want you to stay, engaged and present and motivated. And so, we're actually going to do shorter blocks of work, and we're going to make sure that we manage sort of recovery and intensity, so that we don't get too carried away. That would then create a situation that would allow us to pivot into a race specific block a lot easier than if we were doing sort of, a long phase of development on a particular thing. And then all of a sudden, in 6 weeks, we discover there's a race that we need to do in 2 weeks. And it's like, oh, well, hang on a minute. We've been working on this development phase for the last 8 weeks. That doesn't fit. Well, you need to create some flexibility. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, totally. And that's a perfect place, I think, to wrap up this particular episode, the perspectives on training. And we will be back next week with your thoughts on coaching, which will be really interesting because it will be the first episode on the podcast that is really directed to coaches in particular, although I think that athletes also will find it very useful. So we'll see you in a minute. I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As usual, you can find the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com. And I will link to David's other episodes in the show notes and in the episode description, as well as a link to his appearance on Lionel Sanders' YouTube channel, which we alluded to a bit, and to obviously the usual suspects, his website and social media profile. Next Monday, we will have part 2 of this interview, so make sure you tune in for that. In particular, if you are a coach, that will be something that should give a lot of food for thought. If you have been a long-time listener of the podcast and you haven't yet left a rating and review, please consider taking a couple of minutes out of your busy schedule to do so, because that's one of the best ways to help spread the show and help new listeners find us, which at the end of the day helps sponsors come back to us and keep the show going, because it is a serious commitment in time and money. So we need those sponsors really, and we need to keep the show growing. Otherwise it will eventually die out, and I really don't want that. So rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or wherever you can rate and review it. If you're using some different app that has a different system, do it wherever it's possible. And I am grateful for everything you can do in that regard. And of course, spread it with your friends and frenemies in triathlon. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Take their free online sweat test and get a personalized hydration strategy for your next race, and get 15% off your order with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And big thanks to Roka, that you can find on roka.com/TTS. That's where you can get a 20% discount code for your entire order, whether you're going for wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, or prescription glasses or sunglasses. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.